By 1796, the American experiment was no longer just an idea, but a reality. The Revolution had been fought, the Constitution ratified, and George Washington had set the standard for leadership. But now, for the first time, the country would face a challenge it had never encountered before: a contested presidential election. There would be political divisions, fierce rivalries, and a transfer of power that would be anything but guaranteed. As Federalists and Democratic Republicans clashed, the very future of the young republic hung in the balance. Tonight, Sara Georgini joins us as we dive into America's first true election. We explore the campaigns, the controversies, and the cutthroat politics that shaped the race between best of frenemies John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. How did this election define the American presidency? What did it reveal about the fragility of democracy? And what can we learn from 1796 as modern politics continues to wrestle with the same fundamental questions? This is 1796, America's first real election. Up next on the Napoleonic Wars pod.
Hello and welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars pod, where the Addams family is center stage. No, not the whole kind of Wednesday Addams type stuff. I can tell we're going to get on very well with our guest today because we've been having a bit of a chat about things including Lafayette's clock, which is just kind of casually perched on her filing cabinet, just the right of her desk. So we've had a very interesting conversation already. However, we are talking about Addams America as we continue our series looking at how presidents have, should, shouldn't, can, can't behave, which may, I hope, be educationally quite useful in modern times. And we are joined by Sara Georgini, who's series editor of the Papers of John Adams, which is part of the Adams Papers editorial project and is based at the Massachusetts Historical Society. She's the author of Household Gods, The Religious Lives of the Addams Family, which is published by Oxford University Press. Sarah, hello. Nice to see you. How are you doing?
Hello, Zach, and thanks to you and Josh and to everyone. I'm so glad to be here. I've been in the heart of the archive reading and writing about the Adams presidency for the last few years. I'm so delighted to share some of those finds with you today.
We are excited about this one. As you say, the estimable Provost Marshal, Josh Redden. I could explain to you, Sarah, why he's called the Provost Marshal, but like we haven't got the time in our lives to waste on that. We all have stupid names on this podcast. That'll do as a shorthand. The Provost Marshal joins me, the wielder of the musket, the firer of a round in about 2.5 minutes, if we're being honest. Yes, it wasn't a display of deft and speedy firing, but nonetheless fresh from your training as a musketeer, as a can't really say red coat because you were wearing a green hoodie, and I'm not going to call you a green jacket. So whatever that makes you, good to see you, bud. How are you?
I'm fantastic. You might have to start nicknaming me 4 minutes around. I don't want to spoil the anticipation for that video, but people will have to watch it when it comes out. But I'm very well. Nice to be with you.
From 4 rounds a minute to 4 minutes around. That's an arc right there. Okay, we're going to get into the nuts and bolts of this. And for the second time in as many recordings, we've done this in under 2.5 minutes. Like, we are on a roll in terms of actually getting on with what we're meant to do. It's baffling. And we have to start with the election. And it was a hell of an election. The 1796 presidential election, the first contested presidential election, right, between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. The first one that has political parties with the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. There's a whole kind of alignment and terminology that we tend not to see in the modern US political landscape. Talk me through, Sarah, why this election is different to the two before it. Not so kind of why contested? What's I'm not going to say gone wrong, but what's changed in terms of the desire to actually let's start contesting these. And what were the major issues at play? What sort of feels at stake in this election?
So the election of 1796 is like no other. If you were a voter thinking about how to proceed, here are a couple things that might be running through your mind that hadn't existed before. One, who could possibly succeed George Washington? Who had the character, the integrity, the leadership attributes that would guide the fragile new democracy along its course? Second, you might be thinking, what exactly does a president do? This is a shiny new job that is less than 10 years old and a very delicately written constitution that is quite broad in granting power to all three branches, executive, legislative, and judicial, and a little vague on the details, especially when it comes to the president. Something else you, an American voter of 1796, might be wondering is, what do we have at stake in terms of our foreign policy? Technically, we're a neutral nation, but we've had a hard time maintaining that neutrality. And now we are caught between two opposing powers, Great Britain and France, that are locked in a really violent war. What is our place in that world of war? And how can we maintain our neutrality in it? You might also be wondering about your own economic interests, right? So if you're a merchant in New England, or if you are engaged in business in New Orleans, what are you doing about rising insurance rates, the chances of your ships being attacked and cargoes being lost? You're losing money left and right. Who's going to help you out as president and see if there's a change possible in your own personal circumstances? You'd probably be reading a very partisan press. You might lean toward one newspaper over another. And this is where we start to see the thing that makes the political landscape of 1796 fall into sharp relief: the crystallization of two political parties that are in deep opposition on major ideological viewpoints on all of those issues I just discussed. So we have the Federalists lining up behind John Adams, and we have the Democratic Republicans rising up in opposition and forming a line behind Thomas Jefferson. And so our stage is set. These are our choices in 1796. And it's unlike, as I said at the top of this, any other election, because that hadn't happened before. Washington swanned into a second term and then decided to retire, which, setting up that peaceful transfer of power, is what makes us a democracy, right? So that's really something that he takes the lead on, but it leaves voters confused. How should they turn?
I'm very sorry, Josh. I'm going to sort of wrench the microphone from your hands and talk about a topic that feels rather topical at present. There are lots of mutterings about to what extent will Trump seek a third term in defiance of the existing constitution, despite some pretty pathetic arguments being fielded about why the constitution doesn't apply to him this time around. Part of this goes back to Washington. In terms of the Constitution, quite obviously there is, I want to say, the 22nd Amendment. Is that the right one? I'm getting nods from people far better placed to comment on that than I am. So the 22nd Amendment is designed to prevent that. Certain irony, actually, that I believe it's brought in by the Republicans at the end of the it's when Roosevelt's elected for a third term, right? But there is a tradition, I think it's fair to say, that predates the amendment to the Constitution, that, from what I understand, kind of goes back to Washington and this sort of sense of, I don't want to say gentleman's agreement, but maybe it is a kind of gendered, masculinized sort of gentleman's agreement, that you just don't do it. You know, two terms is enough and you've had your fill, and then everybody does a Washington because that's what Washington does. And you know, he's sort of placed as the sort of the honest kind of ideal of a founding father within a sort of certain branch of the historiography. So can you talk us through this conversation that happens about third term not third term. And that legacy of Washington, is it just that he's had enough by this point and he is, let's face it, quite elderly and decides, no, I'm done? Or is there some kind of look towards and perhaps a nod towards concerns and questions about sort of autocratic and overbearing monarchs, which has been part of what the Americans have been fighting against, at least in theory, well, in part and in theory, during the Revolution?
One of Washington's greatest gifts, as you rightly identify, is that he steps away from power. This is particularly important in the minds of the American people because they are rooted in a British historical tradition. They need only look back to Cromwell to see what happens when someone who is charismatic, who has a standing army behind them, runs rampant in government and upends the country. And this historical example is vivid in their minds in 1796. Now, you're absolutely correct to know that Washington is getting older. He's fought a few wars at this point. Physically, he is in decline and doesn't want to do another term. His first year in office, he nearly dies. He is ill. It is a great secret. And John Adams is sort of, I don't know, hesitant to step forward, but knows he may have to. So he's already been through, Adams has been through 8 years of wondering what Washington will do. And he's sort of summoned to a conversation with Washington where he understands that he is the heir apparent. Now, this is not great language if you're John Adams to use in your letters. And it sets up a major flashpoint of character attacks that take root in the election of 1796, such as it is. And the thing that comes up is that Adams is seen as kind of too pro-British, too monarchical, too friendly in pushing through the Jay Treaty, whereas Thomas Jefferson, too much of a Francophile, but definitely more interested in popular power than royal power. And so the idea that Adams is going to come in, and who knows for how long he might come in, because he has sons to whom he can also create a line of dynastic succession, is a great fear in the mind of voters. That's why people go toward Jefferson and away from Adams if they do. It's this fear of an imperial presidency. And this will become a phrase that historians revisit in the 20th century, as you say, with FDR, and perhaps in the 21st century as well. So thinking about the expansion of executive power, especially with someone like John Adams, who since his earliest days reading and writing history and political philosophy has favored a strong executive, is worrisome. So we're putting someone into the highest office who might gift it to one of their several sons. That is something that is a great source of fear, because he even gets tagged in the campaign press as King Adams, right? This is a real concern for people going into the presidency and going into that election in 1796.
I'd like to kind of ask a question about John Adams and his time as vice president in the previous administration. It's sort of a running joke on this series at this point that we've watched Hamilton. Well, I've watched Hamilton. Zach hasn't, and we like discussing Hamilton. But there's a joke in Hamilton. I can't remember it exactly, but Hamilton says something about John Adams and he doesn't have a real job or something, and he doesn't actually do anything. So what is John Adams doing in the previous 8 years before he's president, and what is his relationship like with Washington?
So I love this question because John Adams answers it a lot himself in his correspondence. And he says, this is the most insignificant office ever created. Essentially, he's supposed to be running the Senate and serving as an advisor for Washington. However, John Adams faces a common problem that many early Americans who are transitioning from colonists to citizens do in this period, which is putting grand high-flying federalist theory into actual practice. So you had a lot of ideas about how to make a government. Now you have to actually do it. And when he was working to co-create the federal structure, he had this idea of the Senate of being either something that came out of kind of a Roman tradition, the elite, the intelligentsia, or something that came out of a more contemporary Dutch tradition, where you had a great manifestation of popular power that was well educated and extremely interested in matters both domestic and foreign. When he actually gets to the Senate, the US Senate, he is not that impressed. And so he really resents being kind of stuck in this role of overseeing them, supervising them. He figures out exactly what he can do, which is break ties. And he breaks a huge record breaking number of ties. And he struggles with Washington personally. He struggles to find a way to connect with him. You know, Adams is a statesman, Washington is a soldier. And this makes them a great ticket together. That's the kind of balance you would want for your first team running the country in this moment right after a war. However, on a personal level, it's not easy. Washington is a Virginian. He is a slaveholder. He is significantly older. Adams is a staunch New England Federalist. Abigail Adams, his wife, does get along quite well with Martha Washington, the First Lady. So you see quite a bit of kind of that Republican court diplomacy that's particularly interesting, but they struggle. Washington is not interested in foreign policy as much as Adams is. Adams reads widely in political philosophy. This is not a focus for Washington. By the same token, Adams has not fought in a war. He has secured money and troops abroad for a war, but he doesn't have the same understanding of the battlefield per se. So these are two very different personalities. Again, ideal ticket, not always the easiest co-workers. And so Washington will turn elsewhere in his cabinet for advice. He will not look to Adams as much as Adams hoped. And so Adams kind of feels like he's operating in the neglectful shadow of the most famous guy in America, which is arguably who Washington is in this moment. So that's kind of where they end up. And he grows more and more resentful. He also does a very Adams kind of thing, which is he finds a way to just, I don't know, sink into being a gentleman scholar for a while. So he writes his discourses on Davila. He sort of tells everybody about his defense of the constitutions and sends it out widely and really enjoys the reception. He moves into that role of being the thinker and statesman. But throughout the Washington administration, he grows concerned about how US neutrality is at risk and how relations are fraying with Britain and France. And this is not something that Washington invests time and effort in. And so Adams gets particularly concerned. He doesn't know really until the first week that he is president how bad things are. And he doesn't realize what a mess he's inherited from the past administration. So that's kind of his relationship with Washington. It becomes more fraught when Adams is president and he's trying to wrangle Washington to lead the growing army. He's seeking his help on military expansion. And Washington is older. He's retired. He's in decline. He is no less political. He is still in touch with his usual Virginian sources in Congress. But it's interesting to see their kind of, when they contract and expand in terms of being friends, they're always political allies, but it is a complicated relationship.
To what extent does he also, you talked about, you know, how he's kind of, he feels that he is living in the shadow of this sort of shining light of what America's future might look like and sort of American principles. To what extent does he suffer in terms of his public image, in terms of that comparison to Washington, having been his VP and been sort of, I mean, he hasn't sort of basked in Washington's light so much as just sort of been sort of stood in the background, and as you say, not really been consulted half as much as he would perhaps like and expect. He's then sort of using these terms like heir apparent without really feeling that he has a handle on things. How much of that does the public see? How much of that gets picked up by the press and therefore sort of influences perceptions before he even gets to go out on the inverted commas campaign trail?
So, two things about that. Adams takes a beating in the press on two continents. He has a really hard time when he's in the Netherlands, when he's in Paris, when he's in London. He is used to being attacked as kind of this unlikely thing, an American minister abroad representing an independent new nation. I will say one of my favorite moments happens in the British press early on, and it really singes him. First off, they claim that the French are paying his salary, so that's not good. The second thing that they claim when he goes to meet George III at St. James Palace, the British press run a story and they say, and I always quote this because I love it, so hopefully your listeners will enjoy it too. They say, an American minister, good heavens, what a sound. Like, how could that possibly be? So you have to understand he is always the fish out of water abroad. And at home, he really expected, like, everybody knows me. I'm probably the most famous lawyer in Massachusetts at this point, having represented the British soldiers in the Boston Massacre. I should be well known in Massachusetts for mainly authoring the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780. There are things I should be known for, and yet Washington, that it's very hard to eclipse Washington on any front. And so if you're going to serve alongside a war hero, a living national treasure, a man who they describe as kind of walking through a room like a living monument, like the marble is ready for him at any moment in his life just to be carved out. That's really going to grate because John Adams, he is a prickly little guy who wants to be popular and he wants to be well loved. And this is, I think, a very relatable thing. If you reach a certain point in your career and you've done a lot of things, he would like to be admired a little bit more so. So going into his very first moments of the inauguration, he is always acutely sensitive to popular feeling when it comes to him and it comes to Washington. He says as he crosses the floor to take the podium, he sees tears in people's eyes and he doesn't know if it's because they're sad to see Washington go or happy to see him arrive. And this is an incredibly touching thing, right? I mean, this should be just the absolute summit, the peak of your career, attaining the highest office. And in that moment, you're apprehensive that you're not good enough and that you'll never measure up to the guy who came before you. And I think that's actually why people are drawn to studying John Adams. He is so full of reaction and feeling and emotion, and he doesn't always contain it well. And that's just so relatable, I think. Someone who's doing their best and never feels truly seen. And when he is seen, it does not go well. The first year of his presidency, he's kind of popular. He's surprised by this. He loves this. This is great. Second year, things take a turn. And a lot of that has to do with the course of Franco-American relations. And he faces something that Washington shoved to the side for 8 years as a problem. And now it bursts forth just fully in flame. And he has to figure out how to quell it.
In true Napoleonic Wars podcast fashion, we've been so busy rabbit holing, we've taken ourselves right up to and danced around a question which I had in mind for later in the episode, but I'm going to ask it now. So, John Adams, for one of the big founding fathers, in quotation marks, he seems to be one who people know little about or less about than, your Washingtons, your Jeffersons, or your Hamiltons. So, you gave us a little bit of insight there into his personality, but I'm interested specifically, you said he's a very philosophical man. He's a thinker. Can you give us some insight into, I guess, what is his philosophy? What kind of thinker is he? And also, I guess, what kind of politician is he? How does that translate into his beliefs?
So John Adams is a lifelong student of government. From the time he's a young man, he's reading political philosophy. He grows up not far from Boston in what's now Quincy, was Braintree then, on a family farm. And his father is a shoemaker, a respected deacon. His mother looms large in his life as someone he always pays his respects to and credits for some of his education and the popularity of the Boylston name across, Europe and the United States, really. But he has this chance to go to Harvard. Kind of every one son in a generation gets to go. He gets to go. He thinks he's going to be a minister. He quickly sees that ministers don't get the best public treatment when they bring up opposing views. And so he thinks, you know what I'll do? You know what no one will have a problem with? I'll become a lawyer. That seems like a nice, quiet life. But let's pause for a minute and remember how law operates in the 18th century mind. Law is a spiritual corrective. If you are a lawyer, you are mending social ills, you are fixing flaws, you are healing people's lives. So, this is actually how he thinks about the law, that the law is a good thing. It is something that can really change someone's fortunes. It certainly changes his. So, he sets up as a colonial lawyer. As I said, he defends the British soldiers most famously in the Boston Massacre. He marries oh so well when he chooses Abigail Smith Adams. They are true intellectual equals and partners throughout their life, and she eventually will become his one-woman cabinet when he is in office. But what happens with John Adams next, what really starts to change his political philosophy, is his engagement with the revolution. And when I think about the American Revolution, it is a plot twist in everyone's lives. He could have been a really good lawyer for a long time, but he sees a chance to litigate against Great Britain, essentially. So he's able to start writing in newspapers. He's able to start advancing ideas about civil liberties, national security, all kinds of rights that people should have, right? This idea of natural rights. So this is something that he really gets involved in. He goes to the Continental Congress, risking his life, his family's fortune, everything to go there. He goes to the Netherlands in order to secure money and troops. He goes to France to get French support. This is not something he ever planned to do. He didn't plan to be a diplomat. He didn't plan to argue for any of these things. The revolution transforms his life and it propels him into this extremely different future than he ever planned. Now, what happens to his political philosophy along the way? Well, he's a good student of history. And he looks back at British history a lot. He looks at French history. He looks at Italian history. And he thinks, well, where did they go wrong? How do republics rise and fall? Where should power be concentrated and how can it be balanced? So, a couple of ideas crystallize in his thought. So, the significance of an independent judiciary, right? The significance of a strong executive and strong central authority. The idea that there should be checks and balances in government. These are things that will become the hallmarks of his thought, and we know them because they're reflected in a lot of the documents and a lot of the founding era. And that's a good thing. You don't want to be the only one crying in the wilderness when it comes to a revolution. You want to, as Jefferson later says about writing the Declaration, you want to be an expression of the American mind. You want a lot of people to be thinking the same thing alongside you because that's how revolutions take off. And so these are the things that really become what he's known for. Now, do his ideas change once he is the guy in power? A little bit. And that's how we get to Alien and Sedition Acts, right? That's how we get to some of the other changes that take place on his watch. So the fact that he's a lifelong student of government, the fact that he's always interested in what works and what doesn't, makes him an incredibly interesting leader. It does not wholly set him apart from the other people of the founding era. So I think you'll see this in your Jeffersons, your Madisons, your Burrs. You'll also see it in Mercy Otis Warren, Abigail Smith, plenty of other women that I can think of, Margaret Bayard Smith as well, amazing journalist, who are thinking about the very same topics. So this idea of thinking of him as kind of separate, we might think of him as a kind of a door to walk through. You know, he's kind of introducing you to these ideas. And then you have this wonderful, complex world of ideas that everyone else is engaged in as well.
Can I talk about the political landscape, for want of a better word, of the US during this period in terms of these two, can we call them parties? I genuinely don't know if we can call them parties yet, or whether they're sort of factions or quite how it works, because what is a party during this period? It's certainly a long way from what we would construe to be a political party today. But you have these two sort of, let's say, pools of thought, with the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. How is that support distributed across the US? We sort of today have a sort of a perception of a Democrat North and a Republican South, which is obviously very complicated with swing states and all the rest of it, but you know what I mean. Do we see anything similar to that? Are there sort of certain states that are particularly inclined to vote Federalist or be more inclined to sort of swing the Democratic Republican way, or is actually everything on the table when it comes to fighting an election?
So everything changes, right, between 1796 and 1801 in terms of the political landscape. What John Adams walks into in 1796 is kind of a strong Federalist New England, a more Democratic Republican South and West. And remember, the West could be Pennsylvania, Ohio, Kentucky. Like that is the West at this period. Um, but even more important, the Democratic Republicans grow out of the old anti federalist critics of the Constitution, right? So people who are concerned that popular power is being shredded by the centralization of a strong federal authority. So power should also be reserved to the states, and they should have a little bit more of a direct governance over people's lives. So that's where the initial kind of growth of, you can say parties, you can say factions, they're not proper parties yet. And the reason I say that is because we don't have a caucus just yet. We don't have like a formal ticket just yet. We see these factions arise, but they're not parties in the sense that we think of political parties today, where they had clear policy platforms that everybody agreed on. So you don't have that quite yet. That's going to emerge in the next century. We're not there yet. The 19th century lies ahead of us. So we're not quite there. You don't have that. You also don't have kind of one central party leader per se. That is up for grabs. And that is kind of what the problem is for Adams and Jefferson in 1796 and 1800, because these are not candidates who run their campaigns or who have anything to do with it. They are completely divorced from it. You have camps of supporters who are going to come out from New England, come out from Virginia, come out from the West, and kind of blaze a trail campaigning, especially in the press. So you do see, looking at that landscape, some regional affiliations. It's also important to think about class. Are the Federalists more the elite Harvard educated types? And instead, you have Democratic Republicans who are the elite UVA educated types? Or is there another consideration here, which is the shift of artisans and urban workers who started out as hardcore Federalists and by 1800 have shifted more to Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans. And the reason they do this has a lot to do with what Adams does during his presidency. So the expansion of the Army and the Navy, the idea that there should be a strong central government that enforces things like the Alien and Sedition Acts, that target a free press, and the idea that just everything that Adams does is so pro-British really, really agitates a lot of people, along with the economic policies that he pulls in to support the Jay Treaty and everything else that he signed with France. So things like a national direct tax, the idea that you're going to pay more depending how many window panes of glass your house has, that does not go over very well with a lot of people who are thinking of moving from Federalist to Democratic Republican. Why should they continue to support a party that doesn't support their interests and, in fact, taxes them more for it? And we have to remember, too, that that question of taxation and representation is oh so fresh in their minds from the last 30 odd years of history. So thinking about that landscape that he inherits and how it really has a volcanic shift during his presidency, I think that's a really great point. And it's not as simple as regional, and it's not as simple as class. But those are two factors that we can use to think about it.
So we have these two diametrically opposed political parties, diametrically opposed on basically every issue, as you say. But the central issue between them seems to be this kind of this question of central power versus popular power, as you put it, whether it's kind of in politics or in taxation or in whichever area. And where I'm going with this is sort of a kind of a spin-off issue of the revolution itself, because on the one hand, America is independent, but on the other hand, it still seems very unstable and the same problems are kind of being talked about. So in 1796, was there still um well, there was a feeling that America was being destabilized, but was there a feeling that it kind of had an uncertain future given the bitterness of these political divisions? And I'm not asking, I mean, like, was there a fear of another revolution or something? But I mean, these two sides who are struggling to agree on anything, and they're still, this is the first contested election. I mean, it was kind of it's new territory for them. So what were the kind of what were they anticipating to happen? Did anyone know? I mean.
So democracy is a fragile experiment in any era, but it feels particularly so in a world where everyone is suddenly at war again. And I think that this is something that you see reflected a great deal in, and I always think this is an undersung part of the archive, John Adams' incoming mail. People are worried. People are worried that the Union will fall. They're worried of foreign intrigue on the borders. They're worried that Britain, Spain, France, and native nations right there with whom we have on the Western borderlands, with whom we have extremely fragile agreements, are going to entirely rupture this experiment. And this is something you see a lot. You see a lot of fear and concern. I think that's absolutely correct to think that it's something where it is always a very hard balance. What emerges from that fear is a big question for Adams and Jefferson, 1796 and 1800. This is going to recur both times. And this is where political parties are going to line up. The question of how do we balance national security and civil liberties? What is the balance between that? How do we defend ourselves, but also make sure that people have all the liberties that we promised them in the Declaration, in the Constitution, in the Bill of Rights? How do we find that balance? And that is both terrifying and energizing for Adams and people of the founding era, because you really don't want to fail. Essentially, if you think of America as this startup in the late 18th century, they really want to make sure that it gets off the ground. And the great challenge that they face is sort of how to succeed in a world where they no longer have the protection of the British Navy. And this is going to be really the biggest challenge for young America all the way through the War of 1812. So people line up between these two questions when they're thinking about which political party they magnetize to a little bit more, because each of those parties, while they don't have distinct platforms, they find a way to articulate an answer, right? They find a way to make you feel like maybe the Union will hold. Here's what we're doing about that fear of stability. We're going to have this set of tax policies, or we're going to revisit our treaties with France, or we're going to look at the most favored nation status we kind of gave Britain and the question of just blowing off all the impressment problems that we did with the Jay Treaty. And that's where people start to look at these parties as answers to how do you solve the chaos? How do you kind of sleep soundly knowing that you're balancing these two things? So the destabilization is absolutely there. It is also a prime moment for parties to swoop in and provide that kind of assurance. So you've answered how the political party system kind of grows. So that's great.
I kind of want to stay with what you're talking about there in terms of those ongoing concerns. How much sort of, not exactly looking over the shoulder is going on, but how much concern is there that Britain is kind of circling like a shark in the water, almost literally, actually, because of the Navy? You know, they're literally the other side of the beach if they want to be, and we don't have a powerful Navy that can just sort of project American power out into the Atlantic and keep the Brits at arm length. Is there, because really there is a whole kind of pool of thought within the UK that's kind of going, well, you know, these Americans, they're having their little experiment, bless them. They won that first round. They'll come crawling back to us. They know which side their bread's buttered. Obviously, not quite framed like that, but sort of nonetheless, sort of patronizing in its kind of tone and in its belief that this experiment isn't going to work. There's also a school of thought within America that actually Canada, that's going to be the next state of the United States. It seems that we appear to be reviving some of that mentality under the current administration. So is there concern? Is Britain a genuine concern, or are we at risk of sort of overplaying this kind of don't go into the water because you don't know what's going to bite you mentality.
Well, the threat of British invasion is somewhat neutralized by the 1790s, but the problem is they're still here. So, one of the major issues is that the British Army does not evacuate the Western Post that it's supposed to. So, for any American trying to push westward and settle and make a new life, you are immediately encountering the British Army, which is not what was promised. And so this is a huge physical reminder that the war is over, but there's still some really important things lingering, right? And the second thing that happens is that when John Adams is named the US minister to Britain and Jefferson is named the US minister to France, we have a really rich set of correspondence kind of talking back and forth to their attempts to deal with the British ministry in terms of getting a new trade deal going. And it is embarrassing. It is, as John Adams said, like making brick without straw. They hit wall after wall after wall. There is no way that the British ministry cares at all about trying to get a trade deal going. And John Adams is pretty upset because this was his dream job of all dream jobs. Like, imagine you're an American revolutionary and you get to stand outside the king's bedchamber and present your credentials from a brand new nation. Like, nothing really says we won our independence quite like that moment. And then to go there and be recognized and to start trying to hash out a new Anglo-American commercial deal, and it goes nowhere. It is one frustrating year after another. He enjoys London cultural life, absolutely. He loves London's intellectual life and all the people he meets, but he is incredibly frustrated by his stymied attempts to renew relations. So these two indicators are not good when he goes home. Like, the idea that they don't want a trade deal, and it's a brief window of peace between Britain and France, like it's a very brief window, and that evaporates as soon as he gets home and he's into the vice presidency and everything else. But the fear that Britain won't evacuate the post, the fear that Britain won't be interested in opening trade relations, that's a really sour hint about what might lie ahead. And so I think they do take it somewhat seriously. What they take even more seriously is a threat of French invasion, because they quickly see that the Jay Treaty, which is extremely unpopular, right, gets pushed through by the Federalists. Democratic Republicans really find a way to stir up unrest. They burn Jay in effigy. They find all kinds of ways to protest this foreign policy. At least it was manageable. Like, we've gone up against Britain. Britain is now too busy to fight with us because they are very busy fighting with France. And that is reliable. Adams says at one point later in his career that he's kind of always caught in this vise between, should we be friends with Britain? Should we be friends with France? When they're at war with each other, we have to really stay all out of it, or we have to be really smart about how we are involved. And unfortunately, he has to deal with the latter. But the threat of French invasion is very real, especially with their Caribbean holdings and the Southern favoritism for them. That is something that they worry about all the time. Adams dismisses it in his private correspondence. He said, "You are as likely to see a French army in America as you are to see it in heaven." So there's some concept of France as a bigger threat in this period going into his presidency. And France has one more thing at the moment that no one else in the world quite has, which is Napoleon. And Napoleon is just on his ascent, thanks to the Egyptian campaign, and thanks to the invading Switzerland, and thanks to the Italian campaign. Like, these are all the ripples that follow Adams through his administration. So Britain, we can work out a deal. It won't be our favorite kind of deal, but it'll be something. And we've negotiated with them before, and they're very busy fighting the rest of the world. France, our once ally, poses a much greater threat.
We're very much dwelling on the 1796 election, but I think it's worth staying with, especially because we're going to be talking about elections a lot in this series. Not least because this is the first one that's contested, and everyone after that point is then contested. So we'll have more to talk about than the previous elections under Washington. I have a question about the mechanics of an election, such as the 1796 one, because they're really nothing like they are today. So, I mean, there's many examples of this, but perhaps the most obvious one is the fact that when John Adams wins, Jefferson, the loser, becomes vice president. So can you kind of illuminate for us really how elections function in a practical sense? What is the electoral process?
Sure. So most people vote from early November to early December, right? It's going to be white male suffrage for the most part, property. You are usually traveling to cast your ballot, which is not a great time of year in a lot of places to do it. And then the process of, I mean, Adams just barely squeaks out a win, right? So it's a 71-68 win. He complains ever after in his private letters that he is a president of 3 votes only, which tells you a little bit about how everyone feels the first time around. It is, he says, it will be a squeaker, is what he writes, I think, to one of his sons, which is kind of charming. But you need to have 70 votes or you need to have the majority, and otherwise it's going to tip to Congress for a tiebreaker. However, it's not really run the same way that elections are run today. So the person who comes in second is your vice president. And in this case, it happens to be Jefferson. So you have a ticket again from people from very opposing parties at this point, kind of frenemies at this point, based on everything that's happened in their lives, politically and personally. And they have to figure out how to work together. So the immediate aftermath of the election, Jefferson kind of departs to be more of a remote, very remote working at Monticello kind of vice president more than anything else, and kind of bows out. But he keeps a hand in terms of getting his intel from friends like Madison, about what's going on. But he and Adams don't have a ton of interaction during those 4 years. Adams initially turns to the rest of the cabinet he's inherited. But the election itself is also a little bit different than we might think in that there's not classic campaigning. So both Adams and Jefferson, it's not like they meet and have debates. It's not like they exchange their views per se in newspapers. They've already been doing that for some time now. People are meant to do the reading and look back. It's not like they go out on a campaign trail. It's more like their supporters kind of run around and plant stories or solicit votes. They also make a point of centering character attacks. So the idea that Adams is very royalist and that Jefferson is in favor of kind of the radicalism of the French Revolution. One is too British, one is too French. Your choices are which way would you go? There's also a lot made of the fact that Adams is, a staunch New England Congregationalist, and Jefferson is a little bit more of a deist. So he is less interested, perhaps, in organized religion. And does that mean he is an unchristian choice and Adams is perhaps the Christian choice? These are the things that are framed for voters that they would see in the press. But you wouldn't have kind of then what you would have now, which is, a formal presser or something where Adams or Jefferson would come out and say something and respond to any of these attacks. That doesn't happen, which is why I think it's a lot of fun to work in documentary editions and to read their private correspondence, because Adams and Jefferson will leave you little hints and clues in the letters. And so will their families talking about the experience of going through this election, which is absolutely tight and absolutely draining. And Adams is, I think, a little surprised that he pulls it off. He will be less surprised when he loses in the election of 1800. Spoiler.
I was going to say spoilers for those of us who didn't know. We were waiting for the next season to drop before we went into that. But I do want to latch on to what you were saying there about sort of private life and family. One of the favorite phrases of this podcast is that nothing exists within isolation, and that's as true to men seeking political office during this period as it is to any other thing that we talk about. So, can you tell us a little bit about that connection with his close family?
Mm-hmm.
How are they affected by this almost kind of seesawing, this guy's kind of sense of, I'm somebody important, but I'm maybe not as important as I feel I should be, and people don't know me as well as they should do, and I've gone for this dream job and it's not really kind of worked out. There's a lot of kind of moments of hope and then sort of crushing reality hitting,
Mhm.
and that takes a psychological toll
Mhm.
on the individual experiencing them, but it also has a knock-on effect for the family that tries to support them. So can you talk us through some of those things?
So politics by default becomes a family business for the Adamses. It wasn't really meant to be, but once John Adams takes that step forward and Abigail moves with him, I think everything changes. And the family gets very used to being in the fishbowl of the press, to having things that they may not like written about them, to having all kinds of conjectures made about their own success or not, personally and politically. So, for example, Adams gets a lot of nicknames in the press. There's always his rotundity, which is due to his sometime corpulence. There is another one that really sticks with him when he's vice president because he sort of helps engineer his son, John Quincy Adams' new role as U.S. Minister to the Netherlands. And that nickname is Daddy Vice because of the nepotism he's seen as engaging in. So Daddy Vice takes on that name. Abigail, who is, not yet in her 60s, is often referred to as that old woman in some of the Democratic Republican newspapers. Adams is sometimes referred to as toothless, bald, fat Adams. He really takes a lot of very personal hits in the press. And he sometimes quotes them in his letters to show like how thick-skinned he is, but also like that's gotta hurt. Like, and you're saying this is what I'm going through. Going after his wife, going after his son-in-law, Abigail Adams II, or Nabby, who's really a really fascinating figure. His daughter, who acts as his secretary, who encodes sensitive diplomatic correspondence, really an interesting person, marries a man named William Stephen Smith, who is briefly an aide to Washington and plays that up for the rest of his life to get every job that he can, to be a speculator, to be a presidential agent. He's always up for things and doesn't get them and drags Adams' name through the mud. So Adams is less than pleased with his errant son-in-law. And this happens a lot too. So there's a lot of kind of back and forth about people who seek to use the Adams name or his patronage, and who can he trust? Like, he usually trusts his family, but not everyone. He has an alcoholic son, Charles, who dies toward the end of his presidency. And you have to understand the losses mount. I mean, going into the election of 1800, he's lost a son. The Federalist Party is in decline. There seems to be no way forward with France and keeping peace. It's a hard time for Adams, and he does take quite a drubbing in the press. He turns to his family, especially to Abigail, for advice and comfort. But this family becomes like the political family dynasty of the 19th century, going into 18th to 19th. And that is not always a great thing. It doesn't make them particularly popular in the United States. And so maybe, we resurrected them in the 20th century a little bit, because an American democracy, that kind of audience, does not want to support a dynasty. That's exactly what we fought a war to get away from. So the Adamses are really, I think, tarnished by some of that outlook, and it certainly shapes the steps they take in the public or private arena. But the family is all. One more thing I would say about the family is they have such an incredible collection of manuscripts, 250,000 manuscript pages here, because they write for the archive. They see in their family experience the progress of the nation. So as the nation goes, so goes the Adamses, and vice versa. And they take this very seriously as multi-generational public servants. So I think their family experience of living through American democracy and all of its discontents, which they sometimes embody, makes it a really unique trove for researchers.
It's interesting, Sarah, because it seems like John Adams was up against an awful lot in 1796. You outlined his kind of personal feelings and doubts, and
Mhm.
you add to that the fact he's up against Thomas Jefferson, who, as we'll cover in that episode, is a kind of a like a magnificent statesman in his own right, a fearsome opponent. And then within his own party, something we haven't really talked about, John Adams isn't kind of universally liked
Mhm.
even. So this all kind of begs the question, to me at least. I mean, why does John Adams win in 1796? What does he have actually going for him?
So Adams still has name recognition. The Federalists are still the party. They've been the party since the beginning, right? While Adams is not a strong party leader, he knows how to toe the line in that moment. He also does bring the diplomatic wherewithal and credentials that voters desperately seek in that moment. Because Jay Treaty is something that kind of falls under Washington's administration. And if we need someone to create a more useful sequel, then we definitely want someone who has actually been to Europe and met monarchs face to face and negotiated with foreign ministries successfully. So this was exactly the right guy. Now, why isn't it Jefferson? Well, it's very tight, right? I mean, Jefferson is very close, but Jefferson is also seen by some voters as a little too much of an egghead. He's a little too much of an intellectual. He has been out of the game a little bit at Monticello, technically for a while, so he hasn't had the same visibility that Adams has had. He is a Virginian, and while Virginia has the most electoral votes, and certainly Virginians will go for him, Virginians would go for Washington forever. It's not until Washington steps aside that they're like, well, maybe Jefferson will be the next. Like, but you also don't want to have a Virginia dynasty in the White House. Now, will you? Well, that's a different episode. But there's a lot of reasons that both of them bring diplomatic credentials, but Adams just overpowers Jefferson in that moment. He's just so much feistier. I think that part of his personality really wins out. If you look at the personality politics in play and you think about them as kind of two halves of an Enlightenment soul, Jefferson is all sense and Adams is all sensation. So it's that reason and feeling kind of dynamic. And in that moment, people are feeling a lot, but they also like doubling down on the Federalist Party one last time. So that's your Hamilton shout out.
Thank you. I must say, true to form, we have gone absolutely and completely off script in this episode and decided very early on to postpone the rest of the episode about John Adams' actual presidency to next time and instead just talk about the 1796 election because it seemed very interesting. That's why we write the introductions afterwards and we deliver them afterwards because otherwise it would make no sense. But Sarah, you have fared very, very well in face of our horribleness, really, in making you answer all sorts of rabbit
It was
holes.
delightful.
Can I
No,
just
no
say, I
regret.
am so sorry. Like we say this a lot to our guests. If we were that sorry, we would change how we do things and we would just stick to the script. But honestly, you've been utterly phenomenal. So please make sure you come back.
You're so kind. Thank you both. I would say history never sticks to a script, so we're in good stead.
That's the excuse we'll use next time, Josh. Note that down.
Noting it down as we speak. As I say, Sarah, you've been phenomenal. Sara Georgini is the series editor of the Papers of John Adams, which is part of the Papers editorial project based at the Massachusetts Historical Society. She's the author of Household Gods, The Religious Lives of the Adams Family, and which you can find in the description, and it's published by Oxford University Press. Right, that is all from us. We have been the Napoleonic Wars podcast. We'll be back very soon.
Folks, do me a favor. Go review the show. Do it right now. 5 stars, please, and a comment. It takes you seconds, but it sends the algorithm wild and catapults us up the rankings. It's the single most powerful thing that you can do to support the hours of content that we provide for free. Love the show? Never want to miss the latest news? Sign up to our newsletter. The link is in the description, and get regular Napoleonic bulletins direct to your inbox. Looking for a present for the Napoleonicist in your life? We have a shop packed with Napoleonic Wars Pod merch. Again, the link is in the description. And did you know you can now gift memberships to Patreon perks that we offer? So if you want to treat someone to our online course, exclusive meetups with authors, green room access to recordings, and exclusive episodes, head to patreon.com/NapWarsPod to find out more. Much love to all our Patreon supporters who are enjoying a rejuvenated and revitalized offering of the perks on Patreon. As I say, head to patreon.com/the Napoleonic Wars Pod to find out how you can join a buzzing community of like-minded Napoleonic nerds who are enjoying things like courses, socials, a book club, green room access to recordings, early releases, exclusive episodes, and much more besides. Their support is empowering us to vastly increase our output and keep you entertained with Napoleonic nerdery on an almost daily basis. Prices start from just £2 a month, so if you can spare the cost of a cup of coffee each month to support us, it would mean a huge amount and might even fund some more documentary work. Shout outs to our patrons who, at the time of recording in January of 2024, were in the mentioned in dispatches tier: Rob Griffith, Brendan Teeling, Beatrice DeGraff, Lynn Dawson, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Stephen Colson, Jim Getz, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbau, Anonymous American, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Carol Dixon Smith, Roland Shark, Giovanni, Jean-Baptiste Van Merlen, Darla Vincent, Brendan Hogan, Peter Findlay, Jeff Maple, Ian Harding, Indiana Fats, Joe Ayres, Robin Brasher, and Daniel Fieldman. The Admirals, Mark Chestnut, John Haynes, Mike Guest, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, David Maxwell, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Kate Walcombe, Clemens Beman, Charles McKay, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Jason Moran, Tim Pritchard, and Seth Hansen. The Chiefs of Staff, Adam Coslin, the Marshals, Ryan Diamond and JC Kaiser, the Legion of Scholars, Dan Hazelwood and Bob Burnham, and in the Crown Yourself tier, Emperor of the First French Empire Todd Campbell and the Duke of Wellington, Laird Campbell. We'll be back very soon, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke, Josh, and Zoe, take care of yourselves, folks. Stay well, and as always, thank you for listening.